Glad to have you back. The Senate and the House of Representatives yesterday passed the 2023 appropriation bill after raising the 20.51 trillion naira proposed spending presented by the President, that's President Muhammadu Buhari, by 1.32 trillion naira to 21.82 trillion naira. The upper chambers also approved Mr. Buhari's request of 819.54 billion naira domestic loan meant to fix infrastructure destroyed by the recent unprecedented floods that ravaged many states in the country. With this level of deficits, the current government is expected to seek 1.7 trillion naira as drawdowns from bilateral and multilateral lenders, as well as 266.1 billion naira for grants, donor-funded projects, and raise the rest from the local and external debt markets. This indeed poses a serious question mark around the funding and implementation of Nigeria's 2023 budget. My guest is a senior research and policy analyst with Budget Nigeria, Mr. Viola Kwaga. Compliments of the season, Mr. Kwaga. It's good to see you.
Same to you, Tolu. Always delighted to be here.
Yes, funding Nigeria's 2023 budget is something that analysts are worried about, but I am also worried about that concerning how we raise revenue to address all the challenges we face as a country. Now, how worried are you, or what is your reaction to this?
I mean, I guess I share the same sentiment that Nigerians across the country share. I'm extremely worried. I think that the GDP growth that we have had, single digits, 2.25% for 2022, which has been projected to slightly increase to around 2.3% for 2023. It means that there really will be difficulties ahead. Perhaps making it more difficult is the fact that next year is an election year. So for the first 3 to 4 months, there will be a level of chaos in the economy. And, the Nigerian economy is one that relies, to a very large degree on signals from the government. Unfortunately, politicians have 4-year cycles, so everybody builds their expectations around that. So looking at, what has been proposed by the National Assembly, which is yet to be assented by the president, I suspect that he will have a couple of reservations, one of them being the increase in the size of the budget. He will most likely pass it as soon as possible. But the problem will then rest on implementation, because as you might be aware, the 2022 budget had to be extended for about 90 days into the next year. So the 2022 fiscal year is actually about 15 months. It's going to be 15 months long. I mean, that has happened before, but this is just to bring into perspective how challenging balancing the economy will be in terms of, raising very scarce revenues that the current 2023 appropriation bill is already exceeding in terms of its deficits.
Proceeds from non-oil sources, of course, like taxes paid by companies, revenues from customs and excise duties, well, of course, seems not to be enough to meet up this demand. Now, how can we improve revenue base? We also know that the Finance Act was passed alongside this document yesterday. Can this help address some of the shortfalls?
I mean, absolutely. I think the Finance Act can do that. But before I comment on that, there needs to be some level of fiscal discipline implemented by the federal government, especially as it regards how it raises its revenue. For some time now, Nigerians have been inundated with the very, very mysterious ways and means financing that the federal government has been unable to prevent itself from accessing. Quite recently, the National Assembly, some members of the House, members of the Senate, I beg your pardon, outrightly refused restructuring of the facility taken by the federal government. I suspect that it may have been, due to concern with who would pay for it at the end of the day. And as it stands, the federal government has, borrowed, in quotes, over 20 trillion, through that facility. I mean, so who's going to pay for that at the end of the day? So prior to, or before we address the issue of, the tax policy and the way the government raises revenue, the government must be disciplined enough in how it raises its revenue. That is something that is non-negotiable. So, looking at non-oil sources, I mean, this is very, very pertinent for a country like Nigeria, where, a lot of our revenue comes from, or a large portion of oil revenue comes from, non-oil, non-tax sources, like the royalties paid and the licenses granted for oil exploration and what have you. And the problem with that is that when there's an overconcentration of your revenue or the highest source of your revenue in one sector, you run the risk of volatility. So where you have supply shocks or there are demand shocks, it really, adversely affects how you raise that revenue. So for the national tax policy, to improve itself, it has to look at what are the other aspects of, revenue that can be addressed, that can be enhanced, that can be improved for the federal governments to really have a diversified source of revenue. And, looking at the Finance Act that was passed recently, a couple of things really leap out. One of them is that the federal government would now, be able to raise revenue through the implementation of excise duty, from different aspects, different sectors, as the Act says, not limited to telecommunications services. So Nigerians are going to be paying much more. And as it stands, we don't even know where, those taxes would come from, but we'll be paying much more in terms of, those aspects of consumption. Again, the Customs and Excise Tariffs Act would be amended to allow the minister to dictate, how these excise and customs tariffs would be raised. Again, another way for the federal government to really focus on non-oil aspects and non-tax aspects. And there are other aspects of the act that are really enhancing the powers and the scope of the government. And another area that I think really can be focused on is the area of special levies. One of them being the Industrial Training Fund levy, the Local Content levy, and the Niger Delta Commission levy. A lot of these levies are understated aspects or understated sources of revenue that the government can really focus on. And for the new government coming in 2023, there has to be a level of transparency granted so that Nigerians can really know what the breakdown of these revenues are, so we can ask the right questions and demand accountability, where it's supposed to come from.
Brilliant stuff there. But our debt profile is also scary, if that's the word to say. My last guest talked about borrowing to fund the 2023 budget and the large deficits that already exist. Ballooning deficit, let me use that word, has risen to nearly 5% of GDP. Now, my question really will be, what does this mean for a struggling economy like Nigeria?
I mean, it means, what a lot of us are very, very worried about and what is already happening. There will be much more borrowing. But, the real question is, so what? When there's more borrowing, it means that the government would be less averse in terms of tax collection. And this would or could possibly hamper the little income that Nigerians are already earning. I'm sure you're aware of the reports put out by the National Bureau of Statistics that has, really increased, or we've seen an increase in the number of poor persons in the country to about 133 million. Now, with a government that continues to borrow and continues to increase, tax and taxes consumption, it would mean that the minimal incomes that Nigerians are struggling to attain. Remember, the Minimum Wage Act has still not been implemented by many states in the Federation. So you have Nigerians really earning very, very little. What does this say for health outcomes? What does this say for education? What does this say for their, livelihoods in general? And, it's important that Nigerians begin to ask the government to really work on reducing the borrowing and increasing its non-oil and oil, non-tax and tax revenues. Some of those improvements can come from a better monitoring and oversight of government-owned enterprises. There are several tens of enterprises that are meant to remit more than they should. The Fiscal Responsibility Commission has, made cries about this several times in the past. And it's important that Nigerians demand accountability from the government in these agencies, in these organizations, and in how they raise their revenue. If you look at the 2022 budget, for example, the largest share of revenue came from operating surpluses. And a lot of these operating surpluses are from government-owned enterprises, but they are deducted at source. So it's easy to collect them. Like I said in my previous submission, the government does need to focus and show Nigerians how it has been collecting its levies. The Electronic Money Transfer Levy, for example, which replaced the Stamp Duties Act, which itself is very, very contentious, as reports show that some collection agencies are paying their levies to the CBN, while some are paying it to the FIRS. This needs to be cleared up, and this needs to be done more efficiently and done more effectively. Looking at the cost of governance as well, it's not just debt that is increasing, but debt for what? If you look at the 2023 budget again, the allocations for recurrence, that's non-debt spending, is over ₦1 trillion more than capital expenditure. Now, this has been repeated. I think this is the third or fourth year that the federal government is spending more on paying salaries and paying overheads as opposed to paying for capital expenditure that will improve, the livelihoods of Nigerians. And I think this is also very worrisome. Finally, I would like to say that the government also needs to look into its asset sales and privatization drive. There are certain assets that the government simply cannot manage. And this is coming from the perspective that the market may be better suited to handle certain things on behalf of the government. Where this can be carried out efficiently, effectively, and monitored transparently, let the market take control of certain assets that the government cannot, privatize those that the government, cannot manage appropriately. And, that would then be a source of non-oil revenue, the licenses, the fines, the penalties, the fees. This would increase, the drive of the government to appropriately monitor and evaluate and supervise, these assets that have been sold and these privatizations that have occurred, which could then bridge that deficit gap or reduce the level of debt, if you will.
Well, you would agree with me, too, that the federal government has continued to focus on promoting non-oil exports, obviously to make more money and foreign exchange to bridge that gap, and of course to support the spending plan and ease pressure on forex. What is your assessment of progress made around that space? Do you think we can get there, talking about making more money from non-oil?
I mean, these are conversations that we really need to have. Going forward, I would implore Nigerians to engage with their favorite presidential candidates on how they expect to engage with the non-oil sector. Like I mentioned earlier, you must diversify your risk portfolio. Nigeria should be run as a company. As someone I follow on Twitter used to say, that we should look to electing a CEO, the chief executive officer, with the mindset that he is running Nigeria as a business, running Nigeria to make profit equitably and justifiably, but also responsibly and efficiently. So looking at the non-oil drive, I think in the past few weeks, the central bank in particular has really been patting itself on the back in the sense that it has, had rolled out several facilities, ranging from the 500 billion naira non-oil export stimulation facility to the 300 billion naira real sector support facility to the commercial agricultural credit scheme to the creative industry financing initiative and the MSME development fund. These are initiatives and programs that the central bank put together to address its race to $200 billion in export remittances. So basically, the central bank is looking at raising or ensuring that $200 billion is brought back to the economy through the stimulation of these various aspects of the economy. And I mean, this should be looked at in consonance or in addition to the 50 billion export expansion facility program, that the federal government put in place that came through the National Economic Sustainability Plan. These are all initiatives that are meant to provide some level of finance to the private sector, to export markets in particular. And, this should also be looked at within the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So with the signing of that agreement, and, a lot of people have expressed their reservations as to we doing that, there's going to be some sort of compulsion for Nigeria to improve its industries, to improve its manufacturing, to improve the quality of its goods. But the question remains, yes, you have increased the level of remittances through export stimulation. I think the CBN governor was quoted to have said that in 2022, there was about $4 billion, $4 billion that they had raised, as opposed to $3 billion from the previous year. I mean, that's just slightly over 1% of their own targets. Is it success? I suppose the Nigerians would have to answer that question. But the issue remains that, are these the only things that the central bank and the federal government should be doing? A side question is, should the central bank be doing this in the first place? These are not the only interventions that the central bank is, putting in place. And, several scholars and analysts have expressed reservations as to the capacity of the central bank to really monitor and evaluate these things appropriately. The central bank, yes, is saddled with the responsibility of ensuring price stability, ensuring full employment, and targeting inflation. Are these the best ways it can do that? And can it do that effectively and efficiently? These are questions we need to answer. And if we look at these interventions, many of them overwhelmingly lean on providing finance, which is a very serious problem. But what about the infrastructure? What about the supply side constraints that the exporters themselves face? Infrastructure, roads, electricity, waste disposal. How much do firms in Nigeria spend to transport their goods from, say, Kano to Lagos if they want to, export those goods? What would that cost them? How good are the roads? How effective is the electricity generation and supply scheme? How cheaply, can they access energy? These are questions that can only be answered by an improvement in infrastructure in general, and these will have multiplier effects. And this also borders on the weak institutional environment. When goods get to Lagos, before they get to the ports, they sweat blood, because it's extremely difficult for them to move those goods, within a very, very short distance. I recall reading a report where someone was comparing the movement of goods in the US and Nigeria, that it took, I think, a couple of days to move goods from one coast to the other, while in Nigeria, for a distance that might be half or one-third that distance, it took, some weeks. So these are really the issues. The federal government seems to be doing well, by its own estimation, but even looking at its targets, it's not even meeting up to 3% of what it has set out. And I really think that the progress needs to be improved.
Well, it's a way to live it, I must tell you. So interesting conversation, really there. I've been speaking to senior research and policy analyst with Budget Nigeria, Mr. Viola Kwaga. Thank you so much for your contribution all through the year, not just for the show today. Thank you. It's really commendable, and we appreciate it. Do enjoy the rest of your day, and a happy new year in advance.
Always a pleasure, Tolu. I look forward to more interviews in a couple of days.
All right.